Metro Supply Chain is the official sponsor of the Ask the Experts Theater at Edge 23, pioneering the future of supply chain with investments in advanced automation, robotics, and business intelligence. Metro Supply Chain delivers innovative, real-world supply chain solutions that advance business. Learn more at metroscg.com.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Expert Theater, sponsored by Metro Supply Chain. Metro Supply Chain is the largest privately owned contract logistics provider in Canada. We have more than 100 operations across North America and the United Kingdom. My name is Sarah Opperman. I'm the Director of Business Development for Metro Supply Chain in the U.S. operations. And I'd like to introduce Trax and turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
We're mic'd up. There we go. Thank you, Sarah. Well, I want to do a little bit of a plug for CSCMP first. I want to thank all the volunteers and the committee members that put this organized event together. It's a great show. I have personally been a member of this organization for decades. One of the former presidents brought me in, and it's been just a great journey. It's one of the foremost educational conferences that I'm aware of that exists for supply chain, and it's really good for the industry. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the conference and get that little nugget that you came for, whether that's educational or meeting other folks and discussing common problems in the industry. So I'm going to start off with just a brief intro of Trax and a little bit of a market reflection, and then I'll hand it off to Josh and Garrett to also introduce themselves. So Trax is a company that specializes in transportation spend management. That encompasses a core best-in-class freight audit and payment process, but also augments that process with technology enablement that facilitates things like on-time payment, visibility of CO2 and sustainability, which is another thing we're going to talk about today, and provides a myriad of services that promote a real, extremely rich data experience and visibility experience for our customers that are trying to manage their carriers and LSPs, manage the cost related to the service and cost to serve to that, and then adding on the sustainability piece. And we'll talk more about that in today's session. Personally, for me, I've been in the industry about 30 years. I've had several roles, including more on a technology side, services side. I'm a practitioner. I've assisted many companies in optimization strategies over the years to improve how they execute, and doing it with all comes back to good data. So my experience has been just how important data, consolidated data, is to almost any conversation that you want to have related to either service, cost, or sustainability, which again, we'll talk about today. So thanks again for coming. And with that, I'll have Garrett introduce himself.
Yeah. And everyone can hear us okay? Perfect. Yeah, so Garrett Wolfe. I'm our Chief Strategy Officer at TriumphPay. So TriumphPay sits inside of a larger publicly traded entity, Triumph Financial. So we are a wholly owned sub of a bank. So we are a chartered bank, and inside of the bank is TriumphPay. And so TriumphPay started about 6 years ago. TriumphPay started more on the freight brokerage and LSP side of things, helping to facilitate payments, and it's evolved over the last couple years to go upstream to the shipper side and create what we'll talk about around a payments network. Not only does how money move, but how do we make sure it moves to the right people, the data around the transactions go to the right people. We want to make sure fraud is pulled out of the system. So we'll talk a little bit about how those things all work. TriumphPay touches around $37 billion of freight annually, largely through the payments we make, actually exclusively through the payments we make. I mean, I guess to be fair. I joined TriumphPay coming up on 4 years ago now. I still remember that it was 4 weeks before COVID set in and we all got sent home for a little while. I don't come from transportation before that. I come more from the innovation and technology space. A lot of time spent helping large corporates figure out how to innovate at scale. So it's just now an opportunity to bring that to transportation, to payments, and try to grow this fintech payments network. But Josh?
Yeah, and my name's Josh Bouk. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Partnership Officer at TriumphPay. I also served as Trax's president for the last 3 years. until about 90 days ago. So it puts me in a bit of a unique position, and I'm thrilled to be here with these two guys. Guys, and I'm going to moderate today. So, and before I forget, for those of you who stay until the very end, there will be a surprise gift for each of you. So stay with us. You'll enjoy it. I'll enjoy it. Let's start off with why. So Garrett, in a time when prices are down, the shipments are down around the world, shipper leverage is maybe the highest it's been in quite some time in this market. Why are we here to talk about the importance of data in improving shipper relationships with their LSPs? Why should they even care?
Yeah, it's okay. Great question. So you're welcome. So like any pendulum, this is a pendulum, and the reason it's a pendulum is because pendulums swing two ways. We don't know how long it'll take to swing one way or the other. So we'll see. But the important part is to be prepared. I think right now, it wasn't even a year ago, I would say. I mean, it's kind of short-term memory, I think, a lot of times in this industry, but it wasn't even a year ago, I would say, that there was a lot of leverage on the LSP side, the carrier side of everything, and there was not enough supply to meet the demand, and things were very different. And obviously, it's completely inverted right now. I think that there's a lot of reasons to make sure that you're very, very focused and very nurturing of your carrier and LSP relationships. I think one of them is just the sheer truth that it'll go the other way. And you want to make sure that when it does go the other way, those carriers, those LSPs are kind of fully indoctrinated in your processes, that they're well trusted, partners in your ecosystem, that there's that you show that you're investing in that relationship, because what you don't want to have happen is to beat these carriers and LSPs over the head with rates right now and then have it just come right back the other way, right? If you're more thoughtful about your pricing discipline and your RFP process right now, I think you'll see that return to you in spades when it comes back around. I think the other big thing that may not be as obvious is there's a lot of fraud right now. I'm sure we're not the only people who see fraud in the industry. When you have some of these trusted, long-standing relationships, it's much easier to trust that they're going to take good care of your freight, whether that's a freight brokerage tendering your freight out or whether that's a carrier, an intermodal supplier, dray, rail. You just want to make sure that freight is going to get to where it needs to in good condition on time, and that everyone's going to be paid the right amount and on time. So anyways, that's what I would say. Steve?
I would just add, it's been an interesting journey over the last 4 or 5 years. I've been in the industry, like I said, for 30 years. And I saw during COVID a complete shift to lack of supply and too much demand. Then I saw it shift to a freight recession almost, where we had more supply than we had demand. And so I agree on the pendulum shift. The key is to maintain those relationships, prepare for either of those events. Right now we have uncertainty in the market about demand again, right, in terms of forecasting inventory and things like that. So what are the consumers going to do this peak season is on the top of mind for a lot of retailers. But maintaining those relationships are really, really important. And it really comes down to looking at how to measure the three aspects that we'll talk about today, Josh, which is cost, service, and sustainability when we're working with LSPs, and how to measure those three aspects of the relationship in your LSP relationship.
Yeah, so that we think of things as the three legs of the stool, right? Service,
right,
cost, and sustainability. And so let's start with service. So Garrett, when we think about service quality between LSP and shipper, give us a model. Give us what are the things that we're trying to measure? Where are we using data to improve shipper transparency to that service quality?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, again, is just the freight needs to move on time to the right place. It needs to be safely moved, and it needs to be paid the right amount. I think for these LSPs, it's important to use the data to say, okay, who has been a good partner of mine? Who has taken great rates? Who has not caused us issues? There are things even more deeply that we'll get into, is who is very easy to work with, not just from finding capacity, but also the billing portion of it, which is where we spend a lot of time. Is if you've got a carrier and LSP that is very difficult to pay because they're difficult in their invoicing process, there's something there that is worth investigating, because the amount of time it takes to do that, the amount of time it takes to reconcile bad invoices and to make sure people are paid accurately, that adds a lot to it, which just causes strain on both sides of the equation, right? If the LSPs have a hard time getting paid, they're not going to prioritize your freight maybe like they would otherwise. And same thing on the shipper side. If the service levels, if they're not on time, if they're very difficult to work with, that's going to show up over time. I think one of the things that we'll get into is this payments network that we're working on to help try to solve some of that problem, right? You've got this is my hypothesis. I believe this is kind of why we're going down this path, but a shipper. So any of you guys that have, you are a part of a shipper, or you work with shippers, you recognize that people are, that the company is multi-division, it's multi-region, it's multi-mode, it's a lot of things, multi-GL, and there's a lot of complication that exists in terms of how costs get allocated into the various divisions, how everything's, and I think that's where a lot of the heat loss comes in terms of the invoicing and payment process. But equally, when you have 10,000 freight brokers and 300,000 for-hire trucking companies, and you can kind of go down the line about how many different service providers there are. Everyone has a different way of doing things. They've all got different systems. They've all got different limitations and constraints internally. And so part of the, I think, structural problem with all of this is, yes, I mean, maybe even the easy part is getting the freight picked up on time, dropped off on time. But everything that happens after that is significantly complicated by the fact that we've got a lot of different disparate systems, a lot of different siloed data, and they just can't come together right now without creating a bunch of challenges.
I had 3 conversations today about data silos. That's very common. And it's interesting. Everyone's in a different place on this journey. But the key is to tie, again, cost to serve, service performance, and again, CO2 or sustainability together in one consolidated dashboard view. And then operationalize that data within the execution aspects of it to make good carrier choice. It's a more mature conversation with your carrier LSP in terms of performance, but it really is breaking down the data silos to create a cohesive visibility against that across, again, all modes, all regions, and all carrier types or LSPs. One last comment on that is, again, the data journey, you'll hear my mantra, it's all about the data, and it is all about the data. And I think we're going to talk a little bit, Josh, about it starts upstream and flows down through a series of processes about data quality and data capture. And you have to be forward thinking about this when you're planning on putting in this control tower concept, if you will, to manage your LSP community.
Yeah, so let's do that now. Let's dig into it. Let's not worry about what the script says. Let's talk about the average control tower. People, I hear that term everywhere I go. Walk us through the key systems that have to participate, because you can't walk this floor and find somebody selling a control tower.
Right.
So what are the key systems, and what are the opportunities and challenges to connect them?
I think it's a great question, Josh. So, yes, there's no platform that's a control tower. A control tower is a concept. It's a framework. It's a framework you have to think about, and it's supported by technology, stacking technology providers on top of each other, integrating data. One of the key areas is looking at it. If we talk about this from a data flow perspective, it really starts upstream on the inbound side with a PO, followed by an ASN or an advanced ship notice in from a supplier to a carrier that says there's a shipment that has to occur from A to B inbound. And then the next question is, who's liable for that shipment? There's a liability, which we talked about, fraud. Are your suppliers shipping inbound to your facility in a invoice collect, Incoterm, and then on the outbound you have the sales order. That's complemented by a data concept called a manifest. So far upstream, you have your sales order PO process and the rigor around the capture of that. That becomes a ASN or a shipment inbound or a manifested shipment outbound from a facility. All of that data capture gives advanced liability information, accrual support, right? Things like that says eventually there will be a cost component related to that shipment activity, whether it's inbound or outbound. The next part of that journey is capturing the invoice from the LSP or carrier. Sounds simple, but when you have hundreds of carriers in a very fragmented industry, that's not easy. You have data continuity issues, you have data quality issues, you have challenges with the maturity of the LSP community, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that later, Garrett. But that's really important. So we're trying to tie the cost of the shipment at the proper level of granularity down to the charge, service level, whatever the case is. But that's all part of on-time payment. Carriers want to get paid on time, but to do that, they have to provide a compliant invoice structure at the very early on of the cycle to do that. Once that's completed and that invoice capture is done in a compliant fashion, then there's the, what Trax does is the audit and allocation. Compliance against a match against the source. Does the invoice match the source that we received on the inbound ASN side or the manifest on the outbound side? Is this truly your shipment? Back to fraud detection. If it's not your shipment, then that's a problem. It goes into an exception. Allocating the cost down to the GL. That's all part of this process as well, right? Who should pay for that shipment? And sometimes it's more complicated than just the shipper or the origin or the sender or the receiver. It could be broken down by tax, duty, separation for global trade, and how all that works as part of that information flow. Anything creating an exception in that process will hold up an invoice from getting paid. Final target is to push that into the ERP system or the AP side for payment, right? Well, if anything occurs as an exception along that journey, that could be directly opposed to trying to meet on-time payment of that transactional flow through that process. So these are all important cost aspects in the flow of data that's through. And a good program that's sustainable will be able to do this with the least number of exceptions as it flows through that entire process. So cost is a very important part, and that all feeds into the control tower concept overall as well.
Yeah, so that makes me feel like there's no chance in the world that an invoice is ever going to get paid on time. So
makes it hard, doesn't it?
Garrett, help us understand how TriumphPay is stepping into that challenge with all that disparate data and data requirements in the environment Steve talked about.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So, I think what we're looking at right now is there's this whole process that you just described about getting everything ready to a place where it's pay eligible, if you will. I'm just going to make up that term. I don't know if anyone uses that term, but it's pay eligible, right? And then there's a different piece of this where it's who needs to be paid on what payment terms, all this, right? Yep. And sometimes those don't coincide completely in sequence. At least that's the way that we're approaching this. So we want to make sure on the upfront side, kind of getting things to be pay eligible, that's where we want to help connect everybody, right? So from the freight audit and pay or the shipper's ERP system or the shipper's TMS or whatever it might be, we want to connect on the one side of that such that connections we have on the other side of the transaction with the freight brokerages, with the carrier community, all that data, we can go get the data that's needed because we know what's needed, but we can go put it exactly where it needs to go, exactly in the format it goes. So that's not to say there won't be exceptions. There will be rate mismatches. There will be kind of accessorial charges. There will be lots of things.
That's where Trax comes in to straighten those issues.
Right. But we want to get to that answer as quickly as possible, right? We want to know exactly what's wrong with it right away, right? In a perfect world, know before it's even submitted what's going to be wrong, right? So that's where we're going. But everything that then, so we want to also get rid of this whole process that has to go on and say, okay, I've got all this statement of invoices, maybe I've got some PDFs, I've got Excel, I've got to match everything. Most of these are going to be good to pay. So we want to get to that. Most of these are good to pay as fast as possible, right? So that we're pay eligible, if you will. But then I think what we're seeing, and maybe you all are experiencing this in your AP groups, your finance groups, but cash is something that needs to be hoarded right now in this environment, especially in our shipper community. We're not beating pay terms, right? Like we may have in the past.
The term conserve. Hoarding might have.
Okay, all right. So we're gonna conserve cash, and before we may have had situations where we would pay ahead of time just to get the invoices out to keep clear and whatnot. But right now it's important to conserve. Okay, so conserve cash. Now what that means in many cases is that we need to move from what were 60-day pay terms, or maybe even sometimes 30-day pay terms, but move them to 90-day. move them to 120 day, and maybe even go further because that's what's necessary for the business, the shipper's business. However, the fixed costs of the LSP side are not changing. They're not slowing down, right? They still need to be paid as fast as they were being paid, if not even faster in this environment. All right, so you've got kind of this natural tension going on where the people on the payee side need to be paid faster and the payors need to conserve cash. And so one of the big things that we step into is to help figure out how to bridge that gap, right? So because we're part of a publicly traded bank, we're able to deploy our balance sheet to help smooth that, right? So a shipper can remain a shipper of choice in good standing, maintain those relationships, still go from 60 to 90 or 60 to 120 days, and we can still make sure that the LSPs get paid on time. Or if you're FedEx or UPS, there's a lot about what goes into paying them at 15 days. Well, we can put the balance sheet to work to make sure no matter what, they're paid on day 15 because that's the right business decision, and then let the rest of these things catch up behind the scenes. But that's one of the biggest things is use the data. Who needs to be paid when? Making sure that everyone is very clear about how to pay everybody. And then use the balance sheet to make sure that you do what's right for every single company in the value chain.
And in the case of FedEx, we know that after day 15 or sometimes day 30, there's an 8% late fee.
Penalty.
That's your head's on the chopping block if you hit that one, right?
Can I talk about that, Josh?
Yeah, please.
So the number one conversation so you remember my conversation about the data journey and all the, sounds complicated, right? It is. But the number one conversation that I have with our large customers, they want to pay their carriers on time, bottom line. So now I have this diametrically opposed, I want to pay on time, but I got all this data complexity. And they want to know, well, what are the mitigating strategies? What are the strategies that I can put in place to ensure I pay on time, knowing that I can't bypass some of these complexities of accurate data capture, accurate invoice, accurate cost allocation, and et cetera. And so a lot of conversations are about some of the things that Garrett just mentioned. So what are mitigation strategies? It's a more sophisticated conversation with your carrier for sure. So yes, we can talk about the statement of accounts, but let's talk about the quality and timeliness of your invoice submission. That's part of the requirement to pay on time. If you submit the invoice structure in a compliant format and on time, there's more likely there's not going to be an exception along that data path that I talked about that you want to try to meet. Another thing could be looking at having rates from the procurement side, having proper documentation of rate and spot quotes at the time of shipment capture and compliance to be sure that we have all those data components in place. So mitigating late payment is almost consistently one of the common conversations I have in all of our large programs. And again, there are different ways of doing it, as Garrett mentioned, but certainly, however you put together your strategy to do this, it is really, really important to maintain those LSP relationships.
Yeah,
Josh?
That's good. And as a shameless plug, TriumphPay has announced that we now have a guaranteed on-time payment option for shippers who are struggling with paying their vendors on time. And so if you want to know more about that, we'd love to talk to you about it at the booth. But, okay, you have one more thing.
One more thing.
Yeah.
So I spend an awful lot of time thinking about fraud and fighting fraud. And there's just this hidden cost that doesn't get captured in a lot of these talking points.
Right.
But the idea that what is on the rise? Well, the other thing that's on the rise is stolen shipments, hostage freight, all these types of things that may be going through freight brokerage, whatever it might be. There are a lot of bad guys right now out there, organized crime rings. And some of you guys may see this with your freight, but there's an enormously hidden cost with those shipments being held up. Even if you recover the freight and it's still okay, it still took all that time and effort, right, to recapture it. And some of it may never be recaptured. And so there's an awful lot, and just in terms of data, knowing exactly who these players are, making sure that they have, across our network, been in good standing. There's no reports of what's going on, that there's no kind of rebrokering of freight, which is a big deal right now. There's no hostage loads. There's no bad discussion about their ability to fulfill service. That's a lot of what we use data to help shippers, freight brokerages, everybody make sure that the people that are touching their freight, again, it's really good to have a long-standing relationship so you can trust it, but that's not always the case. But make sure that when you have a new vendor that they're a good quality vendor, that they are who they say they are, that they have, frankly, the equipment that they say they have, if anyone has any specialized freight, that they make sure that they're going to get it there and only bill you the right amount. And then lastly, make sure that there's no bad people impersonating these LSPs, because that's another big problem you guys may see, is that there is account takeover. There's kind of identity theft, right? There's this thing going on right now where there's a lot of people, a lot of bad guys who are taking credentials, impersonating good guys who are moving freight, and then doing bad things when it comes to invoicing and payments. So I just wanted to put that out there. There's just this hidden cost that is becoming more and more relevant, I think, in the last year or so.
Yeah.
It's always there, but there's just a very hot topic that we see, and being a bank, we're very laser focused on it. So I didn't want us to forget.
Well, I think I can add to what Garrett is saying. So there's a lot of rigor. Let's use parcel as an example. I'm sure most shippers out here ship with FedEx or UPS. Those account numbers are like credit card numbers, right? I mean, you understand that, right? It's a credit toward the account until you pay. Well, the rigor around making sure that the use of those account numbers in parcel is controlled, tightly controlled on who has, especially a third-party shipper, by the way. So sometimes a shipper will use those accounts to use third parties to ship on that account. Knowing who ships on that account is critical. That's part of that fraud detection. So when an invoice arrives at Trax, not only are we checking and validating the rates, we're checking the liability aspects of that as well. Those are the kind of things you want to kick out as an exception in that process I talked about, and start questioning, how did this happen? What's going on? We have real stories where people use FedEx account numbers and UPS account numbers in their own business. And it just flows through and they're getting paid and no one's looking at it.
You mean their own Amway?
Their own Amway business. Yeah. That's right. Yes.
They're supposed to use it for their business.
They're supposed to be using
not that side.
Personal business. Yeah. So, well, you think about it. You're spending millions of dollars with these carriers. You have millions of transactions flowing through your process. You're not going to catch this unless you have a systemic way of detecting through a set of rules and alerts that an anomalous transaction has occurred. The red flag goes up. Someone has to take a look at that, or a pattern emerges. And sometimes, I mean, I think you're right, Garrett. The bad guys have gotten really good. They're finding ways to do this. And when you're spending millions and sometimes billions of dollars on transportation and logistics costs, it's easy to happen. It happens all the time.
I think the last number I saw was 47% annual increase in logistics fraud year over year for the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
So it is climbing rapidly. So guys, with a little bit of time left, I wanted to make sure we touched on sustainability. So Steve, the third leg of the stool, as people are thinking about that control tower and how they're collecting data from their LSPs, sustainability, while it isn't quite as sexy as it was a year and a half ago, it's still critically important to our planet, to our investors, to all the stakeholders that we have, right? So what are the keys to helping a shipper collect, measure, and drive changes in their network based on carbon emissions, Scope 3 emissions?
That's a good question, Josh. So you're right, Josh. If I look back in my career, I spent 80% of the time we spent on cost to serve and service performance. Over the last few years now, sustainability has been that third aspect of data visibility and measurement against my network and against my LSPs and how they're performing. So you think about Scope 3 emissions, and we don't have time to go through all of the calculations, but let's talk about Scope 3. Scope 3 is what's happening outside the four walls of the enterprise. Well, think about it. That's really hard to capture CO2 generated outside the four walls because that's involving your LSPs. One of the common challenges with that is how to get that data at a level where it's not some large average number. Anybody can come up with some average number and just take the total spend and do some simple math, but it's not actionable. It's not operationally actionable. So the goal is to create a dashboard that you could line up service performance, cost to serve, and CO2, and whether that's tank to wheel to wheel, or whatever measurement that you're using, or it could be even extended beyond CO2, to calculate that across all modes, all regions, and all LSPs. So what are your options? And I had a few conversations already at the conference on this. One is you can go to your carriers and try to force them to give you the data. Well, their measurements are going to be inconsistent. They're not going to always be able to support that. They're not able to do it in a timely way. So the answer is, how do we create the calculation as a derivative of the very cost structure that we already capture as part of that data journey I talked about, and that's the invoice. When you think about a common invoice, it has weight, and it may not have distance, but it has, I'm going from point A to B. So if you could derive the distance calculation using least practical or most practical route or by the crow flies, whatever measurement you want to standardize on, we know the weight, right? We know how much, hopefully we know the weight if there's a good compliant invoice. And then we have the calculation of the mode, which fractionalizes that aspect of, is it a full truckload? It's a little different than measuring if it's a parcel or a less than truckload or an air freight. And those calculations can be derived to calculate the CO2 transactionally. So one of the biggest problems that in my career that I've seen is companies tend to want to get the data at the time they need the data, and so they cobble together on spreadsheets the very thing they're needing at the time they need it. It doesn't sustain. I got to go through the same cobbling effort the next time I need it, put it all together. And usually and if I need it more frequently, I spend all my time cobbling and not looking at the very data that I'm trying to use to optimize. What Trax does is it takes that invoice structure and creates an extension of the data with CO2 as the data is going through that payment journey, right? The capture and the allocation. And so now we're able to take the data and not only allocate that data to a cost center or GL or whatever data structure it is, but we can also attribute the CO2 produced along that same transactional journey. So you think about the end product now. I've got my control tower. I've got my service performance by carrier. By the way, this all plays into a great carrier scorecard. Here's how we're performing on time. How is the billing accuracy? Loss and damage. We talked about that. Accuracy of billing and fraud detection. All part of that calculation. Cost to serve. Accessorial percentages. Fuel, which we didn't talk about today, but fuel is a major part of cost. And the whole cost to serve conversation. And by the way, also, here's your CO2 measurement. Right. So is the carrier LSP servicing their fleet and doing the right thing to lower the cost, their cost, lowering the CO2, which, by the way, I have not seen a single case where the cost to serve is almost directly related to also carbon emission reduction, meaning that if you optimally execute, and that's the carrier too, if I maintain my fleet, have good idle regulations, do the right thing, I lower not only the cost, I should be able to lower the fuel cost, I can also lower the CO2. For shippers, they can lower the CO2 by using the right mode of transport, consolidating loads, thinking about their execution strategy. And now if you have the data to support all that, you have a dashboard that shows the correlation between choice of service, cost to serve, and the sustainability or CO2 as a result of that initiative. To me, that's really a fundamental part of the control tower, and it's a great way to go back to your carriers and have a scorecard that's more mature than just having a conversation about statement of accounts, which, yes, on-time payment is still very, very important, but it's really more than that. So,
no,
Josh,
that's awesome. I mean, the way I think about it is, if I'm a procurement person and and I have that single pane of glass, and I'm sitting sitting in front of my trusted carrier partner, I can have a conversation now where I can look at it and say, here's how we're performing together from a service standpoint.
yes.
Here's how we're doing it from a cost standpoint, how compliant you are. We're making sure you're being paid on time, that there's no fraud in our relationship. There's no risk of fraud. And we're both trending down in sustainability, or we're setting targets on that. And that's how I'm managing all of my carrier relationships, all my LSP relationships. That puts me way ahead of my competition in the cases that we've seen. So,
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing. Okay, we are 35 minutes in. We only have 45 before they cut the mics. So I want to give the audience a chance. Any questions on anything we've talked about today? Service, cost, sustainability. Don't be shy. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
We're talking about collecting data depending on the carriers.
Why don't you repeat the question once it's
Could you maybe put the mic?
Oh, well, can it? This is kind of weird.
Sorry, this is weird.
This has got to be a.
Okay. We were talking about calculating the CO2 from a cleansing perspective on your shipments. How do you cleanse that and make sure there's not duplicates? Because dependent on how the invoices are set, you said UPS or FedEx, but when I'm thinking about the invoicing from a mom and pop perspective, those invoices sometimes aren't by the shipment, but by the loops. So how do you calculate that effectively?
So I'll go back to the question. I think it's a really good question. Listen, data transformation is really important. Data isn't perfect. So when I talked about the flow of data, and I kind of glossed over the data transformation aspect of it, but it's really important. So when you get the raw data in, it's never good enough to just directly apply the calculations to it. There's usually a data transformation thing. I'll give you an example. Modality, something common and simple thinking about mode. Well, it's not always obvious. You need to know the modality to know how fractionalized the cost is. Think about a parcel or an air freight. You know, you have to fractionalize the weight and the CO2 from just that component. Because you think about air freight, it's just a pallet on a plane. Well, the plane is the one consuming the total fuel and the output of consumption. So you're fractionalizing that. You got to know the mode of transport. The weight consistency is also important. And again, the distance normalization is something that you calculate. Once you get those fundamental components right, then you can apply the calculation of the CO2 to those fundamental components. So there's a scrubbing process that you have to go through with your data to transform it into a common base. Now, there will always be anomalies. And what I always try to look at a problem is I'd rather throw an anomaly out than try to bring it in and have it skew my ultimate answer. So whether I'm running an RFP and I have to have data to support an RFP event, or I'm using data analysis to create some biased action that I'm trying to create sort of a story, I take outliers and I throw them out. As long as that percentage of outliers don't impact my overall objective, and I can be transparent about that. I could say I've thrown out 2% or 1% of the sample set because they're missing a core component that prevent me from calculating accurately what the CO2 is. So data doesn't have to be perfect, but you can transform it. And then if there's anything that really doesn't meet the requirement, you can throw it out. Now that comes back to another argument that I say a good program of working with your LSPs is to try to get them to maintain the core set of data quality standards you want on their invoice, which is the fundamental data point.
That's where she's asking specifically about how do we cleanse it from duplicates. I know you have an answer for that because duplicates are, what do we see, 5 to 8%?
5 to 8%. Yeah.
Of all.
I mean, we throw those out. Yeah.
But Garrett, do you want to touch on how the network aids in the elimination, identification, elimination, or making it so that duplicates aren't a thing anymore?
Yeah, so you're right. The mom and pops. One of the challenges of a mom and pop is that they may aspire to have great systems and great data and be able to transmit all that, but they can't all afford it, or they're not. That's just not their core competency. So they're just not tech savvy or tech sophisticated enough to do it. So, you know, what the network wants to do is today, the way that the world exists is that those service providers, carriers, whoever it might be, LSPs, they exist in an ecosystem of their tech stack and their data and whatnot. And then the shippers exist in theirs, right? The accounting system, the ERP system, the WMS, the FAP, all the TLA, so the 3-letter acronyms. Right, and so the thing is that they don't talk to each other, right? And so in a perfect world, the payees, the mom and pop system should be able to understand what freight has been assigned to them, right? And there needs to be a network to be able to communicate them. And so that's what we're working on, right? But so in a perfect world, upstream of that invoice being created, the supporting documentation being created, it would all be there. So then it's just a matter of saying that I completed the service and this is what I feel like I should be paying, right? What we're doing right now is it's not quite there yet. So as soon as we see invoices come into the network, we do duplicate checks, right? Because we know who's involved in that transaction, who performed the service, who was assigned the service, right? Who's receiving that invoice, how much should that invoice have been for, how much is being invoiced, what accessorials are there. So we're trying to do as much of that up front as possible. And we give errors. So we try to avoid even starting the billing process. We'd love for 5 to 8% to be 0%, and then again get to pay eligible as fast as possible. So anyways, that's how we do it. We want to put the exception or the rejection of the issue as far upstream as possible, right? And we want to get to more of a world where the LSPs know exactly what freight there are invoices expected for. Does that clear? So if the LSP knows exactly what invoices their partners, their customers are expecting, then it makes it very easy to just go from there, right? So I don't know if that helped or not.
I think it's a great, and I would add to that carrier scorecard. One of the things that we provide on our scorecard back to a carrier is billing accuracy, billing quality. How many duplicates are you sending in that we're having to reject because they're duplication, right, in the billing? So that's certainly part of that data scrub. And you're right, working upstream with the carrier to try to eliminate duplication is key, right?
The other version of this that I worry about is that there's duplication by accident and there's duplication with malintent. And there's more and more of that second version going on, right? Where we just seen too many examples of, I've got a freight bill for, what's today? Today is October 2nd. I submitted an invoice on September 30th for something, and I may come back a week later and try to resubmit the same invoice and just change the date on it and try to be paid again. Or take an invoice that should have been for $500 and add a 1 in front of it or a 2 in front of it, right? And so some of the more sophisticated LSPs, that's not necessarily a worry, but for the mom and pops like they're talking about, that can be if you don't really know those carriers, right? And so there's duplication with malintent fraud is a theme, as you might imagine. So anyways, I just wanted to plug that one out.
I think it's
That's
definitely
good. Anyone else?
On the fraud piece, there's been a lot of talk about expediting the time in which something is eligible, and I'm curious, with the partnership between Trax and how is that factoring into fraud?
Okay, good question. So the question was, I'm guessing most people couldn't hear it, is if you've got fraud is a problem. And just tell me if I summarize this right. If you've got fraud, but there's this push to expedite payments or expedite how fast you can get things to pay eligible, how do you reconcile that, right?
Yeah, and what are we doing together to do
Right.
that?
and then
Right. And so how does this relationship work? So again, that's what this network is trying to solve. If we understand on one side of the network, what invoices are there out there? What advances, what shipments have been authorized, they've been tendered, maybe they're on load. So this is where some of the visibility providers can help out in this space. But if we understand what freight should be moving, when it should be moving, and roughly when to expect an invoice, then as soon as we get the invoice, we just get the invoice, we get it in a structured data format, so we take the humans and the guessing and the OCR stuff out of it, then you can get as fast to pay eligible without the risk, right? But again, it's just making sure that the network can bring together two sides of it, where today they exist totally separately.
And I might just add to that. So you remember I talked about the data flow, the PO, the sales order, and then the ASN and manifest. So our customers that have the tightest compliance framework in place, we call it closed looped, is to say I know every shipment that I'm going to pay for in advance, and I know every inbound, and I know every shipment outbound that I'm going to pay for under, when I say pay for, that by Incoterm I'm liable to pay. Because you have inbounds that sometimes are prepaid. So if we know that upstream, then we should know whether, really far up the process, whether that invoice is, A, if it's not a duplicate, and B, whether you should pay for that by detecting, do I have an ASN match that says I should pay that because you shipped it, or did I ship it outbound to a customer prepaid, meaning I'm paying that freight, that cost, and I can match on that. If we do all that matching far upstream, but gives you all kinds of options in the process to pay, because it's a compliant set of rules that are in place that allow it to be paid.
Yeah. And I think the only thing I would add, and I think we're going to get the hook, is that because Triumph is a bank, we have a lot of know your customer KYC processes in place. So every carrier who wants to be paid has to be able to come in, register, tell us who they are. We do a ton of identity management on the front end to avoid any of those bad actors getting through the system.
Do we have time for more?
Yeah, the question was more about like the RFP process. So a lot of times we focus on cost and service, right? But the painful part is the invoicing piece of it, right? So how do we measure? Is there a way that you can provide measurements in the RFP process to help us understand, what percentage of invoices are coming through correct, or what's your biggest problem? So we would have that visibility to be able to.
Yeah, so I'm going to.
That was one of those questions.
Trax has a dashboard in their product that any customer can go to and see for every LSP they work with how compliant the billing data is on a variety of angles, whether it's accessorials, whether it's required hard compliance fields, whether there's some soft compliance fields that you want, but you can live with if they're a little
Data quality measurements.
Right. But it's all right there. So you can go into you can take that scorecard and you can go into your RFP, you can go into your QBRs with that vendor and be, well, this is falling short, or you're not keeping up with your competition, Mr. Vendor. We're going to need to improve. And so that's all a byproduct of the data that you ingest.
Yeah, and I think that RFP is a place to do it, right? It has more teeth if it's in the RFP. And some of it may end up in the contract terms. I mean, you could really spell it out.
That's right.
You have to provide a data compliant invoice. You have to support it electronically. You have to submit it within days. You can't submit an invoice after 90 days and come up with an invoice and all of a sudden it just shows up. Things like that could go in the contract. So it happens all the time, right? 180 days and all of a sudden an invoice shows up. Well, I forgot to. No, we're not.
The one thing I add before we spill the beans on your big surprise.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Is just that and this isn't a fully sanctioned, we'd love to work with people like you on this, is that all of that is really powerful, but it is still isolated to just the aperture that maybe Trax has, or just the aperture that one of Trax customer has. Like, how compliant are they? How good are they at billing and invoicing? But these LSPs, these carriers, they work for many different companies. They haul freight for many different shippers who use different systems. And so I believe there's a world that we can work towards at TriumphPay where we understand across a broad network of an LSP or a carrier, how good are they at those things, right? So that we can actually bring some of that data to say, you know what, this carrier, this full truckload carrier may be brand new to your company or brand new to even the Trax ecosystem, but they've been active and have been moving freight for a long time in the broader ecosystem. And so how do we bring that power of the network, the power of the crowd to actually help in that RFP process so that even though it may be a new vendor to you, we don't want you to have to go in blind on that.
With 160,000 carriers on the TriumphPay network, we've got a good start, I guess you'd say.
You got it.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. We're out of time. I told you all I would give you a gift if you stayed till the end. The gift is going to be in the booth, and we're serving margaritas at noon. So join us for margaritas, and we'll see you over at the TriumphPay and Trax booth. So it's just right around the corner. Thanks for your time.